Every week we talk about all of the fronts of the war in Europe, but this was a world war, and there are nations and colonies involved that we don't mention quite so often. So to help fill in some of those gaps, let's look far, far to the south. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about South Africa in the First World War. Now, in general, when the war began, English and French troops prepared to seize the 4 German colonies in Africa: German East Africa, German Southwest Africa, Togoland, and Cameroon. The war in Africa would drag over 2 million Africans into the conflict, from Algeria to South Africa, the vast majority of whom did not want war at all, but were pretty much stuck with it since 1885, when France, Britain, Germany, Portugal, and Belgium met in Berlin to finalize the scramble for Africa. I'd like to take a brief look now at South African history before the war to give a general idea of the situation there. Between 1835 and 1845, about 15,000 people moved out of the British Cape Colony, across the Orange River, and into the interior of South Africa. Their great trek was a rejection of the British philanthropic policy with its equalization of black and white at the Cape, and of the political marginalization they experienced on the Eastern Cape frontier. These were the Boers, Afrikaners of Dutch descent.
Hey Andy, you remember me?
Yeah, you're Dan from Extra Credit. Hey, you guys did that series on the outbreak of World War I a while back, right?
That's right, we did, and I overheard you saying that you'll be talking about South Africa today. You know, we actually just made a new series about the history of the Zulu nation in South Africa.
Well, that sounds pretty cool, and you know what? I bet our viewers would actually like to see that because it's related to our topic today.
I thought so, that's why I brought with me this box. They can click it and learn all about the native history of South Africa. You just click it.
Well, sweet. Thanks for coming by, Dan.
My pleasure. You know, you've got a really nice setup here. I like the vest. You should try adding a tie, though. Makes you look more respectable.
Well, I don't think I need to take advice about looking respectable from a cartoon character, but thanks anyway, Dan.
Suit yourself. Get it? Because you're wearing it.
We're done here. Okay, but thanks anyway. See you later.
Okay, bye.
Anyway, the Boers, Afrikaners of Dutch descent. They established 2 independent republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, recognized by Britain in the early 1850s. By the 1870s, though, especially after the discovery of diamonds in 1871 had brought in a huge influx of British immigrants, the British wanted to form a confederation of the Boer republics, the British colonies, and the independent African groups, all under British control. So, in 1877, the British annexed the Transvaal. As you may imagine, the Boers protested and finally revolted in 1880. The war was fairly brief, and the British were outnumbered, and the result was the independence of the Transvaal once again. The Second Boer War, lasting from 1899 to 1902, was pretty much the end game of the struggle for power in the region. Now, this war was highly controversial at the time, as opposed to other colonial wars. For the British were fighting 2 Christian, mostly Protestant, white nations settled by Europeans, and it could not be justified with the arguments of other colonial wars that it was against uncivilized or inferior peoples. Protests actually sprang up around the world, as many saw this as simply a means to gain control of the diamond and gold mines there. The Boers were initially successful and handed the British some hard defeats. The British responded with heavy reinforcements, and by the fall of 1900 had annexed both the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. The war seemed to be over, but the Boers embarked on a successful campaign of guerrilla warfare, taking supplies and disrupting communication and mounting localized raids. The British responded to this with a scorched earth policy, burning some 30,000 farms, and then built concentration camps, effectively ending the resistance. Now that's a really short version, and you should look up a longer one. Fast forward to 1914 as the World War begins, and you see the British influence taking precedence in the South African drive to take the German colonies for their own. And it was in August 1914 that Louis Botha and Jan Smuts took the Union of South Africa into the war in support of Great Britain. Botha had been a leader of Boer forces against the British in the Second Boer War, and in 1910 had been elected the first president of the Union of South Africa when it was formally created. Jan Smuts, another former Boer military leader, was Botha's Minister of Defense. Now, since the end of the Second Boer War, both men had worked for increased harmony between South Africa and Britain, and as the war began, believed that South Africa, even with nominal independence, must support the British war effort. They quickly ordered troops into the German protectorate of Southwest Africa. Many Afrikaners opposed going to war with Germany, though, since Germany had aided them in the Boer Wars, and open revolt soon developed, the Maritz Rebellion, which lasted from September 1914 to early 1915, and which even proclaimed a new government. It was put down by forces loyal to Botha and Smuts, who had declared martial law. So, the campaign against German Southwest Africa. It had overwhelming numerical superiority over the enemy, and by July 1915, the Union troops had conquered it. The following year, General Smuts was put in charge of the conquest of German East Africa. Fighting would become particularly brutal in German East Africa, where the brilliant German general Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck had, in 1915, after some quick early victories, realized that he could never have numerical or weapon superiority over his adversaries, and adopted a guerrilla strategy, drawing more and more local areas into the war. More than 200,000 bearers transported weapons, ammunition, and food for the troops. The myth of the faithful askari, the Swahili word for soldier, still exists today in German history books. In reality, these men had been torn from their roots and were looked down upon by local populations, while back home they were missed in the fields. Harvests suffered or were plundered and destroyed by troops passing through to ensure there would be no food left for their pursuers. Among World War I campaigns, the East African one actually turned out to be the longest of all. As the armistice was being signed in Europe on November 11, 1918, the last of the German forces were still fighting their British counterparts in East Africa. Indeed, von Lettow-Vorbeck finally surrendered 2 weeks later, on November 25th. The most impressive monument for South African soldiers in the First World War is not in Africa, though, but in France. More specifically, in Delville Woods, where the Battle of the same name, part of the Battle of the Somme, was fought in 1916. In mid-July, the South African Infantry Brigade under Major General H.T. Lukin was ordered to clear the wood of enemy soldiers, to provide cover to the flanks of the British Brigade. The South Africans occupied the wood on the 15th, but the problem was not so much to take the wood as it was to hold it, and their orders were to hold it at all cost. Despite fierce German counterattacks and artillery bombardments, the brigade held out until relief came after 6 days of fighting. 6 days and 5 nights. There was nothing left at all of the forest by the end except tree trunks and mud. The German bombardment had been firing up to 400 shells a minute. Only 750 South African soldiers were left, less than a quarter of the initial force. The numbers of South African troops were actually much higher than one might imagine for a colony so far removed from the main action. Over 146,000 men served in South African units active in Africa during the war, and 136,000 South African troops fought in the Middle East and on the Western Front. Actually, one of the main goals of the German military commanders in the African colonies was to keep the South African troops busy so they couldn't be sent to fight against Germany in Europe. One side note here, native African troops from French West Africa saw action in Western Europe, but the British never took native African soldiers off the continent. So, I said that there were political tensions in South Africa. There were also racial and cultural tensions, and in many areas, these frustrations developed into mutinies and uprisings throughout the war. In Nyasaland, now Malawi, the American-trained missionary John Chilembwe led an uprising in early 1915. This was religious as well as being anti-colonial. The outbreak of the war had hardened Chilembwe's views of Africa for Africans, and the German invasion of Nyasaland and the consequent deaths of the locals was the final impetus for the rebellion. It was put down and Chilembwe was killed, but his ideas were fairly widespread, though less violent. There was a big Republican movement led by J.B.M. Hertzog that spearheaded the Afrikaner anti-imperialist movement and became the main political opposition to Smuts. Hertzog would eventually become prime minister. But that was after the war, and it's not my task to speak about what happened after. I just wanted to give you a quick look at what was going on in South Africa during the actual war years. Funny, Nelson Mandela was born into this world at war, in July 1918, when there was still no end in sight. Mandela, considered by many worldwide to be the real father of his nation, embodied a spirit of democratic values and equality for all that was conspicuously absent in each and every single nation fighting the war. Let's hope we've learned something since then. Now don't forget to check out our special episode about General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck right here. And for a detailed look at the story of the Zulu Nation, check out our friends over at Extra Credits and their show, Extra History. It's really good stuff. Seriously. And don't forget to subscribe. See you Thursday.